All right, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. I'm Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com. And if you're new to this forum here, we do this every week at noon Eastern time and record it and put it on YouTube. So you might be watching it on YouTube. But we also have a number of folks who join in live. So we hope to have a bit of an interactive conversation as we do this. And the sessions are broken down into three different parts. There is the news of the week in the world of solar. And then we talk about various webinars and conferences that are coming up in the next few weeks. And then we go into a deep dive about a subject of interest within the solar community, hopefully. And this week we're going to be talking about standalone systems and grid defection. And if you don't know what I'm talking about there, well, you will in a wee little bit. So let's go ahead and jump into the solar news for the week of November 2nd. On October 30th, Illinois legislators passed the Clean and Reliable Grid Affordability Act. That's a mouthful. The bill is now on the governor's desk, and it aims to strengthen Illinois' energy grid and protect communities from rising energy costs. As energy intensive data centers expand and capacity prices spike further, it's expected that within Illinois, as well as the rest of the country, we'll see significantly rising electric bills for communities. The act, they're taking the approach of saying, okay, how can we try and put a handle on rising energy costs at the same time as protecting and expanding renewable energy resources? So some of the key provisions of this act is a mandate to purchase 3 gigawatts of battery storage by 2030 within the state, and to solidify funding for the continued development of new wind and solar capacity. And then they're looking at expanding energy efficiency programs and also instituting new programs to help customers put solar on their homes and businesses. And then the creation of a time of use electric rate by the utilities, which time of use basically says that you will charge more for power during peak load demands, and you will charge less for power when there's less demand. In that way, you hope to stabilize the grid by shifting some of the consumption from high demand periods to low demand periods. OpenAI warned the White House last Monday that China's commitment of building new energy generation could give it a significant edge in the AI race. The company recommended that the U.S. build at least 100 gigawatts a year of new energy capacity. Well, last year, China added 429 gigawatts of new power capacity, which is more than a third of the entire US grid. So they added that in 1 year, and more than half of all global electricity growth. Now, by comparison, the US added just 51 gigawatts of new generating capacity, and OpenAI is saying we need twice that amount. In 2023, China accounted for 63% of global renewable energy expansion, according to the IEA, and is expected to account for about 60% of all of the new load demand within and through 2030. China's wind and solar generating capacity more than doubled in the last 3 years. I'm just changing my, oops, okay, I'm going to have to go with the existing mic. And it went from 635 gigawatts to 1,408 gigawatts, according to the September report. And in early 2025, China's capacity overtook their use of coal. Battery deployment tripled, and China added more capacity in 2024 than the US and the EU combined. Now, as power demand soars, a new report finds that installing gas-fueled generating capacity is getting more expensive and taking longer than ever before. Years of low demand for gas turbines have resulted in limited manufacturing capacity for these units. The 3 major global manufacturers of natural gas electric turbines are GE Vernova, Siemens Energy, and Mitsubishi Power. All have announced that orders placed today will not be delivered for 5 to 7 years. At the same time, projects slated for completion in 2030 and 2031 are now routinely reporting price increases of as much as 75% for delivered turbines. A combination of industrial electrification, changing federal energy policies, replacement of aging existing gas turbines, and data centers have resulted in a surge in demand for these power generators that are seeking the limited supply of natural gas turbines. And a recent poll by Sunrun, the nation's largest residential solar installer, finds 81% of those surveyed have experienced power outages in the past year, and 80% of homeowners worry that data centers are going to drive up their electric bills. The company surveyed 1,000 homeowners nationwide, finding that the public is basically braced for a strain on the electric utility system, and many are seeking actively for alternatives. The survey reports 68% of homeowners doubt that the utilities can keep up with rising electric energy demands. While homeowners expect things to get worse, they report outages are already widespread. 81% experienced at least one outage in the last year. 60% saw three or more. 71% expect more outages over the next year, and only 11% felt they were pretty prepared in case of an outage. And speaking of which, Enphase just added a new off-grid commissioning profile to their systems. This enables the system controller within their latest generation of products to operate fully without utility connection, making it a true standalone system. A few dozen homes, only a very small amount, are fully off-grid, according to Enphase at the moment. The stack requires three things. It requires that you have an IQ battery, the IQ8 series microinverters, and a third-party generator that's connected in. Together, they form a microgrid that can power loads and recharge the battery when islanded or off-grid. The software managed by the generator so that it will dispatch power without backfeeding to the generator, which can be an issue, and also waste fuel. Historically, microinverters have required that there be a signal from the grid present for them to operate, but the IQ8 microinverters are capable of forming a grid signal independent of the grid itself as long as there is sunlight shining. If the site blacks out because the battery is empty and the generator is without fuel, the IQ8s are also capable of reforming the microgrid when sunlight is available and recharging the batteries directly. This is known as a black start, which is a big issue in these things because oftentimes if you're out of fuel, the batteries are dead, well, you need electricity to get them to a certain level so that the system can operate. These microinverters can bypass that. The IQ System Controller 3G connects together with the array, the batteries, the generators, and it can handle up to a 46 kVA off-grid power. For isolated sites, the IQ Combiner also includes a cell modem so that it can transfer all the data without any kind of local broadband connection. And that's the news that I have for this week. Does anybody have anything they would like to add to that? I'll give you just a second while I see if I can set up with the proper microphone. There we go. All right, nothing? Okay, well, let's jump into the, hopefully that works better. The announcements for the week. All right, here's the webinars and the like that I have identified. And if you've got anything you want to add, that would be wonderful. So today, maximizing tax credits for carports and rooftop projects. That's at 2 p.m. Then we have on the 11th, the next generation inverters. These are all through Solar Power World. And I should just remind you that we're giving you these times in Eastern time. And also, I'm not giving you links on this. You can find them yourself. Designing C&I or commercial and industrial storage design. That's on the 13th at 2. We've got another one here, Advanced Solar Design. That's on the 19th at noon. And then there's an in-person conference here, Intersolar And energy storage, North America, that's going to be in Grapevine, Texas on the 18th and the 19th. And then there's another conference, the Clean Fuels Conference in Orlando in January, the 19th through the 22nd. And then our shameless plug for our training programs, the online as well as in-person courses. You can find that at solarpvtraining.com. All right. Anybody have any events or anything else they want to add or attended an event recently that you want to promote or anything like that? I'll give you just a second to jump on in. Okay, well, I'm hoping you'll be a little more chatty once we get into this discussion here. So, all right. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. We've been blaming AI for a lot of things, and I really feel like coming out of the conference that I attended, the Ohio Energy Conference recently, um, there seems to be this kind of subtext of saying, okay, when the grid starts having its problems, now we've got an enemy. We've got AI. We can blame AI for all of the problems. A lot of these things are going to happen anyway, but it gives us a convenient excuse. So I used AI when I was preparing for this, and I said, give me a good outline for a talk about standalone PV systems and grid defection. And it came back with a really nice outline. In fact, a lot of the things I thought it would miss, but it also suggested this title. So I just threw it in here because this is artificially generated for you. It's Unplugged: The Rise of Off-Grid Solar and Grid Defection. Seemed a little trite to me, but what can we say? AI is just a child. All right. So this is what we're going to be talking about. So let's, and I'll just remind you too that these sessions do qualify for half an hour, half a credit for the ETA certification program. So you can get a certificate from our website if you so choose. All right, so what do we mean by off-grid systems? Because oftentimes I always like to avoid this, but we throw around these terms. Those of us who are immersed in all of this, we know what we're talking about, but not everybody does. So I just wanted to go right down to the basics. And when we talk about an off-grid system or a standalone system, we're really talking about a system with no grid connection. So when we look at the components, starting at the array and going all the way to the loads, we go from the array to some sort of combiner box or junction box. It's just a wire management thing. You need to have some way of turning it off. You want to turn off at every power source. So that there's a DC disconnect. And then there's typically, and this is the old lead acid battery systems where you have a charge controller. Charge controller is just a traffic cop between the array and the battery bank. Says, okay, well, let's not overcharge our batteries. We're going to pull power from the array and put it into the batteries. If we don't need any power, we're going to stop power from flowing. We're also going to prevent battery power flowing up to the array when it's dark, because the array can actually serve as a load. So there's a blocking diode in there. And then sometimes it's a simple connection point to DC loads where, if you've got some DC loads in your home, like fluorescent or LED lighting or security system or something like that, why should you take that DC power that's being generated by the array, turn it into AC power in the inverter, and then reconvert it from AC power to DC power and use it in DC loads? So you can take the power directly from the array or the battery bank, service these DC loads. This happens sometimes, but not always.
So we warmed up quite a bit since then. Others below freezing.
All right. And then from the battery bank, we're going to go into the inverter. And the primary purpose of the inverter is to convert DC power to AC power.
Mother Nature is not going to.
And then there's a generator oftentimes that is interconnected. We've got people background noise there. And so the generator is often connected into the inverter. And with a standalone system, this is normal because you don't want to have to design your system for the worst case scenario. You want to design it for the normal situation. So you would have this backup generator that's there in case there's long periods of time where there's no sunlight or whatever. And that's going to then take you and it's going to typically recharge your batteries. So that's normally what's going to happen. So the batteries fall below a certain level. You've set it up so that the inverter automatically turns on a generator, and we would call that then an inverter charger. All right, so that's kind of a standalone system. Then there's an intermediate step where we're going what we would call a grid interactive, or they're basically two different systems. Yeah, Pete, you got a question?
Yeah, 2 points. One is as you talk about there's loads that run on DC and there's no reason to invert to run DC loads.
saying
There's a
still,
lot on that list,
plug
which I
in
won't go
this
into at
system
this
it's all
point.
towards the
But I want to make the point that inverters
thing
actually draw a lot of
hopefully they all can
power
join
when they're
together.
not actually inverting. So there's especially during the overcast weather when electricity is short in supply, there's definitely a case to be made for turning off the inverter overnight or at other times when it's not needed, because that draw is not trivial.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, and even the battery management systems within lithium ion batteries do, they have that draw that continues on all the time. Most people, I guess, if you're doing standalone, you're probably very, very aware, and you're willing to do that kind of maintenance. Most people, though, I mean, they're just kind of building and forget it. That's their hope. Well, the old school at least, and I don't know, do you have a standalone system at your place, Pete?
No, my thing is running things DC direct when possible. And as I say, it's a long list of things that will run on DC direct.
Yeah, but oftentimes DC, well, I was going to say, and I don't know that this is still the case, but DC appliances were very expensive. I mean, in the early days of solar, that was, you buy a DC refrigerator, you buy a DC. I mean, it was long before inverters. You just had the system and you bought all DC appliances, and they were pricey.
Sure.
But now we're seeing increasingly all of these appliances that have the little converters, all the boxes and the plugs. You can just walk through your house and see, oh, that's DC. My laptop's DC. Those lights are
Right.
DC. My television's DC. It's a growing list. But of course, most of those are manufactured to run to convert. Some of them have dual plugs. You could plug in you know, a, a DC source, but not all of them. So
Right, right. Yeah, no, I'm talking about things that run on 120 volts AC or 120 volts DC. Long list. So later on, I'll ask if we're seeing movement for the DC bus voltage moving up to 96 volts, which would make that even easier.
yeah, yeah, and I can sort of give you. I have heard that because of the NEC changes. Yes, we are seeing that because within the home, the battery voltage up until 2017 was restricted to 50 volts DC. Or no, it's 60 volts DC, 50 volts AC. Might have that backwards. Anyway, it was a 48-volt system. But now with the energy storage systems, that's been bumped up to 100 volts. So you are starting to see higher voltage appliances or higher voltage systems being installed. And you can put in voltages up to 600 volts in a resident, a battery bank, as long as the battery system itself is considered inaccessible, that it's only can be serviced and accessed by a trained technician. So, example might be a Tesla Powerwall, where it's a self-contained unit and can only be worked on by certain Tesla certified folks. So those can go all the way to 600 volts. So we're starting to move towards higher voltage battery backup storage. Well, we get into something with the DC coupled system, and it's effectively a standalone system, but also connected to the grid. So these systems are designed so when the grid goes down, when the grid is connected, it operates like a regular grid tied system. If you're generating power, it goes to the battery bank, it goes to the loads. When the battery bank is full, for the most part, now this is changing, but historically, the batteries were there in case the grid went down. If the grid goes down, it senses that, it disconnects from the grid so that you're not backfeeding the grid, so that some worker out there is suddenly electrocuted because they think there's no power on the grid and you're pumping power onto the grid. This is known as islanding. So all inverters have an anti-islanding provision that keeps them from pumping back onto the grid. So what you need is some sort of transfer switch. It could be built into the inverter or it could be separate. And it says, okay, the grid's down. I'm going to physically disconnect from the grid. And now I'm going to use our batteries and our solar array to run our loads. And you can run all your loads or some of the loads. Well, the DC coupled system, logically, you've got solar power coming in, it's DC. Then you've got batteries and it's DC. And it all goes to the inverter and then it's converted to AC. But the other one that's getting increasingly popular, largely because of Enphase, is AC coupled. And AC coupled comes into the inverter, and then it goes, in this case, to another battery-based inverter. And so you've got power that's converted to AC, then it's sort of converted back to DC to go to the battery, and then from the battery it's inverted again and goes to loads. That's, you would think, very inefficient, and it is, except that these conversions and inversions are getting better and better and better. So 10 years ago, it might have taken 10% of the power to make that conversion. Today, it's going to be closer to about 2%. So you do it 3 times, from DC to AC, from AC to DC, and from DC to AC again. Well, you've lost 6%. Yeah, it's a loss, but it's livable. And really, that's becoming popular because of microinverters, where many, many people, Enphase has about 60% of the share of installs for residential systems. Well, until they came up with this AC coupled process for microinverters, you couldn't add batteries to your system. That was a real downside for microinverters. Now you can do that, but you're still going to suffer, 6% losses. And as we said, there are also going to be losses because of the battery management system that's built into the lithium ion that does suck some of the power out of that. So every system has losses. So those are a quick definition of what we're talking about in here. Standalone systems, while they do exist here in the US and have for a long time, especially in the early days, and I think many people who are becoming familiar with solar, this is what they think of as solar. You build a cabin in the woods, you tell the man to stick it, you raise some dairy goats, you're just kind of living the dream, and you're away from the grid. You're living up in Banff, Canada, right, and skiing, because that's what you're doing now. So you're off there in the hills of Montana. Well, that's not the normal solar systems that we're dealing with. But it is still a thing, third world, of course, when you've got remote systems. So 155 million people, according to the statistics, have off-grid living in, and a great portion of that is going to be solar. A lot of it is just biofuels. I assume fires, wood heat, that kind of stuff. All right. So the traditional reason for putting in off-grid solar here in the US has been the high cost of connecting. The grid has been a bargain. It has been a bargain for a long while. It's been pretty reliable. It's been pretty inexpensive compared to putting in your own energy system. But if you live far enough off of the beaten path, it can be super pricey, and you don't have to live miles on top of a mountain somewhere. The cost of connecting is going to be, I looked it up here, and it's, underground lines are going to be as much as $2,500 per 100 feet. And I know from my own experience, that's not off, because our farmhouse was 400 feet. And when we had to repair it, it's 10 grand to get the wire buried and all of that. So if you live a significant distance from the place of connection to the grid, well, you're going to, a lot of people that I've spoken with, the utility says, yeah, it's going to cost you $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to run some poles up to your place or bury the underground power lines. And at that point, you're just going, really? I can put in a standalone system cheaper than that for sure. So why don't I just do that? So that's been the traditional reason why you might put in a standalone system. And but that's changing, and it's changing now. I was going to add to another reason, and we're seeing this more and more, might have to do with if you wanted to hook up a solar, if you wanted to put a traditional grid-tied solar system on your home or business, and the utility determines that their transformer is undersized or antiquated to serve that connection, they're going to bill you for it. They're going to charge you for it. And if they say, okay, well, you want to put it in on your business, it's going to be $20,000 to replace our transformer. Well, at that point, you just sort of throw your hands up and go, I'm not paying you 20 grand to fix equipment that you probably should have been fixing anyway. I'll just put in a system myself. So that's another reason there. So what's going on now? What's changed? Well, the economics of this have changed. High electric prices. We're seeing high electric prices, and if you've joined us before, more and more we're my thesis. I really truly believe this, that we're going to see electric prices double at a minimum over the next 3 years. And this is 100% because of load demand. We're just about to be a tsunami of load demand. I'm seeing from the powers that be, the authorities, the people who should know, they're anticipating much lower increases, but still significant. I think that they're really underselling. I think normally when you're embedded in an industry, you tend to say, well, things are going to change. But it's going to be like it was, but just a little bit more so. Well, I think it's going to be significantly different. So high electric prices are happening at the same time as these systems are getting cheaper. So that's an option. That's something that's going. Grid reliability, we'll touch on this a little bit, but just the statistic we saw in the news where 80% of the people are seeing power outages, 60% seeing them fairly frequently. Well, that doesn't have to happen a lot before you start going, you know what am I paying for here? So I think we're going to be seeing, I'll show you a thing that just blows my mind, but it's going to get a lot worse. Interconnection delays, we'll talk about that. If you want to do that, or you want to connect to the grid, the systems, the bureaucracy, the purposeful delays that are being imposed upon you are significant. And then access charges. We see this personally on the farm where if you have solar, our local utility, our co-op is charging $46 a month just for the privilege of connecting to the grid. Well, at some point, you start to say, well, I can put in a battery system and go independent of you at a cost that's less expensive than me continuing to pay you for the privilege of connecting to your system, especially if the system is unreliable and the cost of utilizing that system is exorbitant. So those are, somebody's saying, oh, $90,000 for a half-mile connection to the power pole. That's from the chat there. Okay, so anybody have any comments here as I take a pause just for a second before we get into this? Throw that open. Everybody's being quiet. All right, well, I found this diagram here when I was looking through, and I find this kind of interesting because this sort of puts together, it's from a paper that a couple of professors put together, but this is what's happening that will encourage people to leave the grid. So I think we're going to hear more and more this term grid defection. And grid defection is basically saying, I have the ability to connect to the grid, but I'm going to disconnect. I'm going to go unplugged, as AI said. All right, so electricity prices rise. Well, we're seeing that. You're in an area of high solar irradiation. So there is a solar resource available to you. If you live in some place where there's very little sunshine, no matter what, you're just kind of limited. Maybe the cost will become prohibitive. But if you're in some high sunlight areas, Hawaii, Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, then the economics are in your favor. When you start seeing the costs of these systems decline, and that's what we're seeing. Okay, so the two we're already seeing: grid prices are increasing, costs are declining. Those are happening in tandem. Then the feed-in tariffs or the net metering become less attractive. And we're seeing that happen. We've reiterated this many times, where it's not atypical today to see that you're paying 4 times as much as what they're paying you. So you might be paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour, but when you send power back to the grid, they're only paying 5 cents or 4 cents. So they're claiming wholesale versus retail. I think they're messing with the numbers a little bit, but it just makes it more and more logical for you to then install batteries so that you keep the power you're generating rather than send it back to the grid. And it's a very short step to go from a grid interactive system where I've got batteries and solar to a standalone system where you say, you know what, I don't need you. You're making life too difficult. I'm just walking away. The technology advancements, of course, higher, more efficient systems, battery systems that last for 10 or 15 years that are warranted for that. If you had to replace your batteries every 2 or 3 years, it's just not economical. Well, that's no longer the case with these high quality lithium ion batteries that we're seeing. Hybrid systems, like I said, if you've already installed battery backup because of grid unreliability, low net metering prices that they're paying you, time of day pricing, they're even starting to put demand charges on residential. So you've got this hybrid system already in place, and all you have to do is just add one battery and you're a standalone system. Well, it's a quick step. And then, the last one, well, we'll say smart grid. Well, they're basically going into microgridding. All right, so excuse me. So we're already seeing really 5 states at this point in the United States, where according to a study that I just read, 5 states it's cheaper to go off grid in many parts of those states than it is to connect to the grid. So California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Massachusetts, and New York all meet these various criteria of why would I connect to the grid when I can put my own system in cheaper? And that's a combination of high prices at the local, bad net metering, and cheap prices for standalone systems. So we're seeing those come down. Now, as far as grid reliability, this is something, and I know I've mentioned it in past sessions, but I just cannot, it just blows my mind. And I don't understand why people aren't freaking out about this. I don't see a lot of it in the trade media. But the Department of Energy in July put out this report basically saying that we're going to see blackouts increase 100-fold by the year 2030 in the US if we don't make some major changes. And since that time, we've seen not only there is not an expansion of generating capacity, but there's a retraction by the federal government canceling $24 billion of generating programs, canceling transmission projects. So it's not like we're making a major shift in the positive, we're making a major shift in the negative. And already they were predicting 100 times the power outages. And if you apply that to what we're experiencing today, on average, this means that the average consumer by the year 2030 will experience 2.5 hours per day of power outage. And that just freaks me out. I mean, I cannot imagine the political ramifications of this and the business ramifications of this. And this is the thing that's just going to drive grid defection. If you can't rely on the grid, you're going to go independent of it, or at least come up with something that will support you when the grid is down. So that's that thing is just beyond me. Then we talk about interconnection delays. And if you've ever been involved in trying to hook up your own solar system and working through one of the utilities, it's frustrating. We will joke sometimes here in AEP territory, you can get 90 days or more of delay from the local utility trying to keep you from getting permits and getting permission. I had an example with our application. Apparently, they've got like 30 days to review it. So on the 29th day, they come back and say, oh, you know what? You put your middle initial in one part and you didn't put your middle initial in another part. So we want you to reapply, resubmit your application, fixing that problem. Okay, now we've got another 30 days. And so they've just delayed this competitor, because solar is a competitor to the utility. And you'll never convince me that this is not a corporate strategy where they're adding this. Now, so 90 days with the utility for a 2-day installation. I mean, seriously, you can get the thing installed in 2 days, but it takes them 90 days to give you permission. But if you go out on the grid scale world, you ain't seen nothing yet. The average in PJM, which is the regulatory region, the transmission authority for the Midwestern United States. So it goes basically from New York City to Chicago. PJM just stands for Pennsylvania, Jersey, I guess not New Jersey, just Jersey, and Maryland, I think. But it involves in Ohio, parts of Illinois. Anyway, grid tied systems connecting to the grid in 2025 on average had an 8-year wait for permission to connect. So we're dealing with this grid emergency, and we're looking at these queues for connecting these systems to the grid. And right now, the queue is twice the size of the US power grid. So double the capacity of what exists today is sitting there waiting in line for getting permission to connect to the grid. And I know PJM put in like 5 years before they said, I don't know if they've lifted it, but they said, we're not even going to look at new applications for 5 years. So if you're building data centers, if you're building these new industrial complexes and you want to connect to the grid and you want a big solar array or whatever, well, what are your choices? Your data AI is not going to wait 8 years for PJM to decide that you can connect that power. So this is a big issue. And obviously, a lot of those systems are not going to be built. There is not twice the grid size waiting to be built, realistic projects. But what a lot of the companies are doing is saying, hey, if you're going to take 8 years, I'm going to get myself a place in line just in case we're going to build one of these things. Because those spots then become valuable. So you just simply, I'm thinking of it. Let's just put in our application now, get in line. But there's no way that's going to work. So what are the AI people going to do? I mean, we're hearing a lot about all these new data centers coming online. How are they going to deal with it? Well, this was one of the discussion points that we heard a lot at the Ohio Energy Conference. And they're basically saying, you know what, we'll put it behind the meter. Those of us who can do this, we can afford it. Let's build our system behind the meter. I don't need to get permission from PJ&M or any of the regional transmission organizations in order to connect to the grid, because I'm not really connecting to the grid. And if you make my life difficult, I'll just create my own little microgrid, and I'm not even going to tie it into the grid at all. I could use the grid as a backup, sort of the over-under kind of thing, where if I do have a high demand, a surge of demand, I can pull some from the grid. If I have extra power, I can send it back to the grid. But if you make my life difficult, I'll just bypass you altogether. And so I really think what works for a single family home, which we're already seeing, where you say, okay, Mr. Utility, I want to power my house. I put in a solar array. I put in a battery. You're now jacking up my access charges. You're playing games with me. I'll just disconnect. I'll just defect from the grid. I can do that as a homeowner. I can do that as Google. I can set up a data center and I can be completely autonomous. In many respects, that's helpful. It's certainly going to be the case if there's 2.5 hours of power outages every day. My guess is these guys are going to get priority because they've got the cash. But you know, we're going to see a massive shift from what has been in the utility world to what will be. And behind the meter is where it's going to be. When we start seeing energy shortages, energy outages, the folks that have the money are going to create their own systems. And then that just puts more and more strain on the ones who don't have the resources, who are still part of the grid per se. So that's going to be problematic. But this is really what we're talking about with grid defection. And I think it's sort of a reinforcing cycle too. The more people who leave, there are certain amounts of fixed costs. They now get allocated back to those people who remain. And that just causes more people to leave because you're adding these costs. There was a really good example that was pointed out to me at the conference with our local electrical co-op, and they were given an aging coal power plant by AEP, and Ohio Power took this thing. It's not Ohio, Buckeye Power. Buckeye Power took this plant, and they were just tickled because they got this thing for free. Well, yeah, it was not worth free. So the discussion at the conference was they're going to be closing this plant, and it's going to cost significant amounts of money to close that plant. So they will allocate that to all of their subscribers. And the number that was thrown around was $26,000 per customer will be added to the utility bills to close this aging coal power plant. Well, they're not going to just give you a bill for $26,000. They're going to allocate it probably over 30 years, but that's going to add $1,000 to your annual electric cost. Well, that's a good motivation to leave. And if you leave, now that $26,000 per customer becomes $30,000 or $35,000. So the ones who remain have to pay a bigger and bigger share. My guess is the government will step in and bail these people out, the companies, not the individuals, and, whatever. But it just points out that when you start adding costs to the electrical system, and we're already in a place where it makes economic sense for you to leave, it motivates more and more people to take advantage of that. And the power source that's going to be serving all of this is going to be solar. I'm getting sort of annoyed with all of the discussion we talked last week about small nuclear, which is a non-starter. Best case scenario was going to be 19 years in the future. We might be talking about something that's 4 times as expensive as solar, which makes no sense. Natural gas, we just see from the news this week, it was already at least 50% more than wind and solar, and now it's going to be twice as much because the turbines are going up 75%. So why are you going to be picking a more and more expensive alternative just because you like it? I mean, they're not. They're going to pick the cheapest alternative. So you can see from this trend line, back in 2010, a significant amount of our new power was from coal. A significant amount was from natural gas. Very little was from solar because the economics were in that favor. But as we transition over the last 15 years, we get up to modern times, to this year and last year, and it's almost all wind, solar, and batteries. Why is that? It's because those are the cheapest alternatives, and that's not going to change. I mean, let's say that you decide, let's subsidize the heck out of natural gas. Well, we're already seeing that if you place your order, it's going to be 5 to 7 years before you get that turbine. So we're stuck at 90-95% wind and solar for the next 5 years minimum. So that's what we're going to be dealing with. Well, if that's the case, why not just install it yourself? And then the utilities are playing around with these things. Now they're talking about demand charges for homeowners. What they're really trying to do is get away from saying, I've raised the price of electricity from 12 cents a kilowatt hour to 24 cents. I'm still going to double your costs, but I'm going to do it in a way that seems less politically sensitive. I'm going to stick you with some demand charges or whatever. So that's an issue. All right, so that's sort of a rant for a little bit. Let's see if we've got any before we get into the systems that are out there. Anybody have any feedback, any comments? Throw that open to you guys. Come on, somebody. Anybody on the call here at the moment who lives with off-grid? All right. Okay, well, let's talk about some of the systems that are out there. The ones that I tried to find out, because there's not a lot of this information that's being kept
Hey,
at the
Jay,
moment. Yeah, go ahead, Pete.
this is Ted.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I live off grid. I put that comment in about the cost of just connecting to because I had to do that exercise. If I were to connect to the grid, um, I am looking at now. Um, I've got a 2.0 system, meaning I've upgraded it one time. Probably another 5, 6 years, I'll be looking at upgrading again. And the whole, I would focus more on upgrading my inverter battery system, but until then I haven't really gotten into the specific details because I figured all that's going to change simply in the next 6 months or so.
yeah,
So yeah, I'm interested in your off-grid info coming up here.
sure. Okay. All right, great. And Krista, I saw your hand was up.
Yeah, thanks. My husband and I have got a place we want to try to keep off the grid. And it really, in a lot of ways, I have the things that you've said have really reinforced my fear that the grid's not going to be very reliable. Um, we live on the grid in most ways in our lives, and have got our 401k and that kind of stuff. But I don't know, I there's a part of me that just wants a hedge, I guess. And the fact that it's making government at every level is making it so hard for people to do both, just kind of blows my mind. I'm very interested in advocating for making it easier for people to do their own solar, off the grid. I understand also there's a lot of building regulations too that can be a real curveball. But it sounds like I should have gone to that Ohio conference because there may have been some of the answers there. But who's advocating for the utility customer here?
Oh, almost nobody. Yeah, the utilities have the ear of the elected officials. Certainly we saw that here in Ohio with the first energy scandal, where they basically gave them $60 million and they got $2 billion in benefits. So yeah, the utility customer, the small customer is always the one who's going to get shafted. But the good news is, of course, technology has been catching up, and we haven't even thrown in the whole idea of electric vehicles as battery backup and the changes of virtual utilities and virtual power plants. All of that's going to just change this environment so much. But in the short term, the next 3 to 5 years, I think one of the results is going to be a large amount of grid defection. Then when they come back and try and fix this in some form or fashion, it may be too late, And when I talk to utility people, I always say, you should be giving me some reason to remain other than the provision of power, because I can do that for myself. You should be coming up with connected energy services, because the thing that you have the advantage of that I cannot provide for myself is connection to other customers. And just like the internet wouldn't do me any good if nobody else was using it, there are services that might exist. I don't know what they are exactly, but that's for them to figure out and become billionaires. They need to, there are services that require the connectivity. What they are, I don't know, give me free Disney Channel with my electric. I don't know, something. So, all right, well, let's jump into some of these items here, just because I was kind of surprised when I started looking. Well, I'll just recap. I wanted to put in Enphase only because this is new, and so I was just going to highlight that. But the ones that popped out at me when I was researching what are these off-grid systems that people are using? Well, SunGold, EG4, EcoFlow, and Solarc. I throw in Solarc. They didn't come up as much, but I've used them and I like them. So I just thought I can talk about them. So SunGold Power, and I think the thing that really sort of surprised me as I was looking at these numbers is how cheap they become. This was because I really haven't done a lot of off-grid, but this is the traditional 48 volt, 120 output or 240 output. Well, it's got a 10 kW battery, 10 kilowatt hour battery, lithium ion, a 5 kW solar array. I think the 12 kW inverter, and it's all for $8,500. Now, this doesn't include the racking system, but you figure probably you can get all of the materials. This is, for $2 a watt. That's cheap. You install it yourself, suddenly this is comparable to a grid-tied system. The costs are comparable. So SunGold, I know it's one that people like, high quality. The package in this case comes with the panels and the inverter and the charge controllers and the batteries and everything else. So SunGold. Now EG4 is another one, and I think this may actually be the preeminent system that's out there on the market at the moment. And you can see that the pricing structure is fairly similar. Here it's another $8,500. This is off-grid. It's a 7.2 kW solar array, and it has. Let me see. I don't remember what the size of the inverter was, but it was comparable to the one that we just looked at. I've got another system here from EG4 that I threw in there. A little bit more expensive, but it's got a 12 kW inverter, and it's got the 7 kW solar array, 7.38. It's got the lithium ion batteries, 14 kilowatt hours. This is a pretty big system. And you're talking about under $10,000. So, this is not, it feels to me, just without really spending a lot of time looking at it specifically, but half the price of what these things used to be. So they're becoming quite affordable. EcoFlow, another system. And what we're starting to see with some of these is stackability. So in this system now, you're looking at the base price, the base system of a 6 kilowatt hour storage, but it can be expanded all the way up to 90 kilowatt hours. The same with your arrays, 7.2 all the way to 21.6 kW. I mean, these are big systems. These are, McMansion sized systems. So they're really becoming, and the price, when we look at this system here for the startup model, which was the base, I think it was, what did I say? It starts at 6 with a 6 kilowatt hour battery at 7.2 kilowatt array. You're looking at 6,500. So again, the racking is not included in this. So you're going to have additional, I'm sure there's wiring and conduit and disconnects and all that other stuff for the base model. So again, you're looking at less than $2 a watt for your standalone systems. And That's very affordable. I think a grid tied system, you're looking at closer to about $1.50 a watt for just the grid tied system. So we used to say the standalone systems were twice the cost. Now it looks like they're only going to be 30% more or so. And if your utility's making it tough, why not? Now I couldn't find a good system for Solarc, but the 8 kW inverter, about $5,000 for that. Then you throw in your batteries. And so that's Solarc, and then Enphase, because I wanted to just throw this in as a comparison. And I think this is going to, since so many people are using Enphase at the residential level, and if you simply plug in a battery with their new world of solar, because the new system from Enphase has, if you've ever installed or you've dealt with the Enphase system, the old system used to have had the panels, then it went to a combiner box. The combiner box was just a way of combining the various branch circuits. And then that went into a system controller or a transfer switch or a smart switch. And then you hooked in your generator to that smart switch, and you hooked in your batteries to that smart switch, and then you hooked it into your service panel. So that was the brains of the outfit, and it was a pretty pricey piece of equipment. Well, now they've done away with that, and they put the auto transfer switch in the meter collar. So anyway, now you can put in these systems, and it's just a software thing to make it grid independent. So if people really continue with Enphase, and it represents 60% of the market share as it does today, and then the grid does something where you want to defect from the grid, it's a software solution. It's not a big decision to simply say, all right, well, disconnect me. Fine. I'm just going to live independently. So we're in that change, in that process. So. All right, I'll give you one last chance. We've got about 3 minutes before we see how are these with existing grid tied, putting in storage. Yeah, I mean, that's going to depend on your existing grid tied. But the Enphase, certainly, if you're one of the 60% that is already using Enphase, then that migration would be pretty simple. So any last comments before we call it a day? All right. Well, I appreciate your interest and attendance, and we'll see you next week. We're going to talk about solar carports and all of the different options there, and different panels that you would use, and issues and concerns with putting solar as a carport rather than on your house. All right. So in the meantime, we'll see you guys next week. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.